If you enjoy intense mafia romance stories filled with danger, obsession, and unexpected love, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter. She didn't mean to say it out loud, but the words slipped from her mouth anyway, sharp, reckless, and fearless in a way she had never been before. Say it again, she scoffed, lifting her chin as she met his gaze. I dare you. The room fell silent, not the normal kind of silence, the kind that presses against your ears, the kind that warns you something terrible is about to happen. Every man standing in the private lounge froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the music seemed to fade into nothing. Because no one talked to Adrian Volkov like that. Adrian slowly set his glass down on the marble table. The soft clink echoed louder than it should have. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush forward. He simply looked at her, dark eyes unreadable, calculating. You have no idea, he said calmly, what you're playing with. Maya Reed felt her heart slam against her ribs, but she didn't back down. She had spent her entire life backing down. To bosses who talked down to her. To men who thought silence meant weakness. To a world that constantly demanded she be smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. Tonight, she was done. Maybe, she replied, folding her arms, you're not as scary as everyone says. That was when it happened. Adrian stood. Chairs scraped softly as his men shifted uneasily. They knew that look. They had seen it before. Right before deals were broken, right before enemies disappeared, right before blood stained the night. Maya felt it too. The air changed, thickened, tightened around her lungs. Adrian took one slow step toward her. Then another. She stayed rooted to the floor, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. He was tall, dangerously so, and when he stopped inches from her, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Say it again, he murmured, his voice low, controlled, and far more terrifying than a shout. Provoke me one more time. Her pulse thundered. She could smell his cologne, dark, expensive, masculine. She could feel the heat radiating from him. But instead of fear, something else sparked inside her. Defiance. I said, she whispered, refusing to look away, maybe you're not as powerful as you think. For a moment, Adrian said nothing. Then he smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was the smile of a man who had just been challenged, and decided to enjoy it. Everyone out, he said quietly. What? Maya blurted before she could stop herself. His men didn't question him. They didn't hesitate. Within seconds, the room was empty, the heavy door closing behind them with a decisive thud that sounded a lot like a lock sealing shut. Now it was just the two of them. Alone. Adrian reached out. Not to touch her, but to brace his hand against the wall beside her head. She sucked in a breath as he leaned closer, his presence overwhelming. You walked into my world uninvited, he said softly. You spoke my name without permission. And now you think you can challenge me. Maya swallowed. I didn't know who you were. That, he replied, eyes darkening, was your first mistake. Her mind raced back to how this night began. She had only been here to deliver documents, one last freelance job before quitting the agency that kept sending her into places she didn't belong. No one had told her the client was a mafia boss. No one had warned her that Adrian Volkov controlled half the city from the shadows. If she had known, she would have turned around. Maybe. You don't look afraid, Adrian noted, studying her face. I am, she admitted. I'm just not running. His brow lifted slightly, as if that surprised him. Most people beg, he said. Some cry. Others apologize until they lose their voice. And what happens to them? She asked quietly. That depends, he replied. On whether they bore me. Her stomach twisted. So what happens to me? Adrian straightened slowly, giving her space, but not relief. His eyes lingered on her like she was a puzzle he hadn't decided how to solve yet. You interest me, he said at last. That's far more dangerous than anger. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. I don't belong here, she said. Oh, leave. We'll forget this happened. Adrian chuckled softly. No, we won't. Her breath caught. Why not? Because, he said, stepping past her and opening the door, you looked me in the eye and dared me to lose control. He paused at the doorway and glanced back at her. And I don't let things like that go unanswered. As his men re-entered the room, Maya realized something terrifying. She hadn't escaped danger. She had just become part of it. And Adrian Volkov wasn't done with her yet. Maya didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Adrian Volkov's face, calm, dangerous, unreadable. His voice replayed in her head, low and certain, promising consequences without ever saying the word. By morning, she convinced herself that it was over. A moment of arrogance. A brush with power she would never repeat. Men like him didn't chase women like her. They erased them, or ignored them. She chose to believe she had been ignored. That illusion shattered at exactly 10:17 a.m. when two black cars pulled up outside her apartment building, sleek and silent like predators waiting for permission to strike. She stood frozen behind the curtain, heart pounding as one of the men stepped out. Expensive suit. No expression. He looked up at her window as if he already knew she was there. A sharp knock echoed through her apartment moments later. Maya's instinct screamed at her not to answer, but fear rooted her feet to the floor just as firmly as curiosity pulled her forward. When she opened the door, the man didn't introduce himself. He simply held out a phone. The screen lit up, showing one name. Adrian. Before she could refuse, the call connected. "You took your time," Adrian said smoothly, as if this were a casual check-in between acquaintances. "I didn't give you my address," Maya said, her voice tight. "No," he replied. "You didn't." That single sentence told her everything. He knew where she lived. He knew where she worked. He knew things she had never chosen to share. Her throat went dry. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to continue our conversation," he said. "And I don't repeat myself." The line went dead. The man at her door gestured politely toward the hallway. Maya grabbed her jacket with trembling hands, every step feeling like she was walking deeper into something she wouldn't be able to escape. The drive was quiet, too quiet. The city blurred past her window as her thoughts spiraled. She tried to remind herself that nothing illegal had happened. He hadn't threatened her. He hadn't touched her. And yet, she felt like she was already trapped. They took her to a place that didn't exist on any map. A private penthouse overlooking the city, glass walls stretching into the sky. Adrian stood by the window when she entered, hands clasped behind his back, watching traffic like a king surveying his territory. He didn't turn around right away. He let the silence stretch until her nerves burned. "You look tired," he said finally. "I didn't sleep," she replied honestly. "Good," he said. "That means you're thinking." She frowned. "You brought me here to analyze my sleep schedule." He turned then, his gaze locking onto hers with unsettling intensity. "I brought you here because you challenged me in front of my men," he said. "And instead of apologizing, you doubled down." "I didn't know who you were," she said again, clinging to the same defense. "You knew enough," Adrian replied. "You knew power when you saw it. And instead of stepping away, you leaned in." Maya crossed her arms. "So what? You're going to scare me into silence?" His lips curved faintly. "No, I'm going to give you a choice." That surprised her. "A choice?" "Yes," he said. "You can walk out of that door right now and pretend this never happened. Or you can stay, knowing exactly who I am, and see where this goes." Her heart raced. "And if I walk away?" "Then we're done," he said simply. She studied his face, searching for a lie. There was none. He meant it. The danger wasn't in force, it was an invitation. Something about that unsettled her more than threats ever could. She thought of her small apartment, her quiet life, the invisible way she moved through the world. She thought of how alive she had felt when she stood up to him, when fear and courage collided in her chest. "If I stay," she asked carefully, "what happens to me?" Adrian stepped closer. "Not too close. Just enough. That depends on you." Maya let out a shaky breath. "You're not used to people saying no to you." "No," he agreed. "I'm not. And what happens if I say no now?" She pressed. "Then I respect it," he said. "But you won't." Her jaw tightened. "You don't know that." "I do," Adrian said quietly. "Because you're still standing here." The room felt smaller. The city below pulsed with life, unaware of the moment unfolding above it. Maya realized that this wasn't about fear anymore. It was about control, and whether she was willing to give up a piece of hers to understand him. "I'll stay," she said at last. Adrian nodded, as if he had already accounted for that answer. "Good," he said. "Then we need to set some rules." "Rules?" she echoed. "Yes," he replied. "You don't lie to me. You don't provoke me in public. And you don't underestimate what you're stepping into." "And you?" she asked. I don't make promises I won't keep, he said. And I don't let anyone hurt what's mine. Her stomach flipped. I'm not yours. A dangerous glint flashed in his eyes. Not yet. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Maya felt the pull of something she didn't understand, something dark, magnetic, and terrifyingly intoxicating. She had crossed a line the moment she dared him. Now, standing in his world, she realized the truth she had been avoiding. Adrian Volkov wasn't just intense. He was inevitable, and walking away was no longer as simple as opening a door. Maya told herself she was only staying to prove something, to herself more than to Adrian Volkov, but as the hours passed inside his world, that lie became harder to maintain, because nothing about this place allowed distance or neutrality, and Adrian himself made sure of that, moving through the penthouse with quiet authority, never rushing, never raising his voice, yet commanding everything and everyone without effort, and Maya found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing how his presence filled the space, how even silence bent around him, how the men who entered spoke less and listened more, how power followed him like a shadow, and it scared her because a part of her didn't want to run anymore, a part of her wanted to understand him, which felt like the most dangerous instinct of all. He offered her coffee, not asking how she took it, somehow getting it right anyway, and that small detail unsettled her more than threats would have, because it suggested observation, attention, intention. Relax, he said when he noticed her stiff posture, you're not a prisoner, and she laughed softly, a sound edged with disbelief, replying, you say that like it's comforting, to which he responded calmly, it's a fact, but facts, she was learning, could still be frightening depending on who controlled them. As the afternoon stretched on, Adrian spoke, not about crime, not about power, but about strategy, about how cities worked, how people made predictable mistakes when they thought they were free, and Maya listened despite herself, arguing when she disagreed, pushing back when something felt wrong, and each time she did, his interest sharpened instead of fading, his gaze lingering like he was cataloging her reactions, measuring how far she would go, and it dawned on her that this was another test, not to break her, but to see if she bent, and she didn't, not completely, which only seemed to draw him closer. When evening fell, the city lights igniting below them, Adrian finally spoke the thought that had been circling all day, telling her that staying here meant being seen, really seen, not just by him but by the world he controlled, that curiosity could quickly become liability, that attention always came with a cost, and Maya felt the weight of that truth settle in her chest, yet instead of backing away, she asked him why he was warning her if he wanted her here, and his answer was honest in a way that startled her, because he said he didn't need people who stayed blindly, only those who understood the risk and chose it anyway, and something in that explanation felt uncomfortably close to respect. Dinner was quiet, tension humming beneath every exchanged glance, and when she finally stood to leave, relief and disappointment tangled inside her, but Adrian stopped her with a single sentence, telling her this wasn't over, that walking out tonight didn't mean walking away, and when she asked if that was a promise or a threat, he smiled faintly and said it depended on what she did next. The next morning, her normal life felt wrong, like clothes that no longer fit, the noise of the city dull compared to the intensity she had stepped into, and when she returned to work, she noticed things she had ignored before, how people talked around power, how fear disguised itself as politeness, how easily systems bent, and she hated how clearly she could see it now, how Adrian's perspective had rewired something in her mind. By noon, the consequences of staying began to surface when a colleague casually mentioned her name in a conversation she wasn't meant to hear, tied to a client she didn't recognize, a client with influence, and the realization hit her hard that her proximity to Adrian was already changing how others perceived her. That doors were opening without her knocking, that danger wasn't always loud or immediate, sometimes it arrived quietly, wrapped in opportunity. That night, her phone buzzed with a message containing only an address and a time, no signature needed, and she stared at the screen for a long moment, knowing she could ignore it, knowing she should ignore it, but also knowing she wouldn't, because the truth she had been avoiding was finally impossible to deny. Adrian Volkov hadn't forced his way into her life, she had stepped toward him, drawn by the gravity of someone who lived without apology, and the real danger wasn't what he might do to her, it was what she was becoming by staying, by choosing intensity over safety, curiosity over comfort, because once you looked directly at a world like his and didn't look away, you could never truly return to who you were before. Maya arrived at the address just before midnight, a converted warehouse hidden between abandoned buildings, its exterior deliberately forgettable, and yet the moment she stepped inside, she understood why Adrian had chosen it, because this place wasn't about hiding, it was about control, about knowing exactly who entered and who didn't, and as the heavy door closed behind her, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever she stepped closer to his world, a mixture of caution and anticipation she no longer bothered to deny. Adrian was already there, standing near a long table covered in maps, files, and glowing screens, his jacket off, sleeves rolled up, looking less like a distant myth and more like a man deeply involved in something real and complicated, and when his eyes lifted to meet hers, there was no surprise in them, only acknowledgement, as if her arrival had been inevitable. He didn't greet her with words, only a brief nod, and that subtle dismissal of ceremony reminded her again that everything with him operated on a different frequency, one where intention mattered more than politeness. She asked why he had called her here, and instead of answering directly, he gestured toward the table, explaining that every decision he made had ripples, that power was never static, always shifting, always demanding attention, and as he spoke, she realized he wasn't boasting or intimidating, he was teaching, deliberately pulling back the curtain just enough for her to glimpse the machinery behind the image, and that knowledge felt heavier than ignorance ever had. He told her that curiosity, once noticed, became a liability, that people watched those who stood close to him not out of loyalty but strategy, and Maya understood then that her presence here wasn't just about him testing her boundaries, it was about the world reacting to her proximity, reshaping her whether she wanted it or not. When she asked if this was a warning, he corrected her calmly, saying it was preparation, and that word settled into her mind with unsettling permanence. As the night wore on, men entered and exited the space, conversations happening in low voices, plans forming and dissolving in real time, and Maya stayed on the edge of it all, observing, absorbing, noticing how often eyes flicked toward her, measuring, calculating, and she felt exposed in a way she never had before, not because she was weak, but because she was visible. At one point, Adrian stepped closer and asked her quietly if she was overwhelmed, and she surprised herself by answering honestly, admitting that she was, but not in the way he expected, that what scared her most wasn't danger, it was how quickly this world was starting to make sense, how easily she could see its logic, and something unreadable passed through his expression at that, something like approval mixed with caution. He told her that understanding didn't make someone powerful, but it did make them responsible, and responsibility was a burden few people wanted once they realized what it truly demanded. When she finally left the warehouse in the early hours of the morning, the city felt different again, sharper, louder, less forgiving, and she realized that each encounter with Adrian stripped away another layer of innocence she hadn't known she still carried. The consequences of that became clear over the following days as subtle shifts continued to ripple through her life. Calls returned faster than before, strangers recognizing her without knowing why, opportunities appearing that felt unearned yet undeniably real, and with each change came the uncomfortable truth that she was no longer anonymous, that safety through obscurity was slipping away. When she confronted Adrian about it during their next meeting, accusing him of dragging her into something she never asked for, he didn't deny it, but he didn't apologize either, instead reminding her that she had been offered a door and had chosen to step through it, that power didn't seduce by force, it attracted by clarity, and she hated how much sense that made. Their conversations grew more intense after that, layered with tension that wasn't purely conflict or attraction but something more complex, a meeting of two wills refusing to bend completely, and Maya began to understand that Adrian's intensity wasn't about dominance alone, it was about precision, about knowing exactly where lines existed and deciding when to cross them. One evening, as rain hammered against the windows of his penthouse, he told her a story, not of his rise, but of a mistake he had made years ago, trusting someone who didn't understand the cost of standing beside him, and the quiet anger in his voice revealed more vulnerability than any confession could have, because it wasn't regret that haunted him, it was the knowledge that some people weren't built to survive the weight of his world. Maya listened, realizing that his warnings to her had never been empty, that his restraint, however subtle, was deliberate, and that scared her more than cruelty ever could, because it meant he cared about outcomes, about damage, about consequences, and perhaps, dangerously, about her. When he asked her why she kept coming back, she hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't give too much away, but the truth pressed against her ribs, demanding release, and she admitted that part of her wanted to know what it felt like to stop living on the edges of things, to stop being careful all the time, to choose something intense even if it came with risk. Adrian studied her for a long moment before telling her that intensity always collected its price eventually, that curiosity, once indulged, demanded commitment, and as she left him that night, his words followed her like a shadow, because she knew the balance was shifting, that staying was no longer a passive choice, and that whatever came next would require more than courage, it would require sacrifice. Maya had grown accustomed to the feeling of danger threading through her days, a quiet tension she carried like a second skin, but nothing prepared her for the moment Adrian Volkov's presence became unavoidable, when the air around her seemed to hum with his intensity even when he wasn't physically near. She had convinced herself she understood the rules, that staying in his orbit meant observing, learning, and surviving, but reality refused to be simple. That morning, she received a message, a single word, "Come," followed by an address she had never seen before. The simplicity of it was terrifying. She arrived at a secluded rooftop parking lot, the city lights below glimmering like distant stars, and the sense of exposure made her pulse race. Adrian was waiting, leaning casually against a black luxury car, hands in his pockets, a figure that seemed carved from shadow and precision. "You're punctual," he remarked without warmth, and she offered a tight-lipped smile, because her punctuality was less a virtue than the instinct to obey the unspoken rules of his world. They moved in silence as he led her to a nearby penthouse, a place even higher than his own, with panoramic views of the city and glass walls that made the night feel infinite, and she realized, with a thrill she didn't want to acknowledge, that every step toward him erased a layer of the life she had thought she could reclaim if she simply walked away. Once inside, Adrian didn't speak immediately. He gestured for her to sit, then paced slowly along the floor, hands clasped behind his back, eyes flicking to her occasionally with that unreadable expression that made her heart thud painfully in her chest. "You know why you're here," he said finally, his voice low, deliberate. Maya shook her head, though her stomach twisted, because she knew she did, even if she didn't want to admit it aloud. He stopped pacing and studied her like a sculptor assessing a raw block of marble, then walked closer, each step measured, controlled, dangerous. "You're in my world," he said quietly. "Every choice you make here matters, whether you realize it or not. You crossed the line the moment you dared me in front of my men, and now, every action you take ripples outward. You are visible, not by accident, but by design. And visibility has a cost." The words sank in like ice water. She had felt the thrill of challenging him, the intoxicating pulse of danger and attraction, but she had not anticipated the permanence of it. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, a confession more than a denial. He tilted his head slightly, as if amused by her honesty, then said, "No one ever does. But desire and consequence are not negotiable. You wanted intensity, you have it." She swallowed hard, because there was truth in that, undeniable and raw, and it terrified her. Adrian moved around the table and picked up a small object she didn't recognize, setting it before her without explanation. She leaned forward, curiosity warring with caution, and saw a sleek, black envelope containing documents tied to a deal she had no right to witness, plans that involved names, numbers, and movements she didn't understand but that radiated influence, power, and danger. "Study it," he instructed. "Tomorrow, we'll discuss what it means. You will either understand the weight of this world, or it will break you." Maya's hands shook as she accepted the papers. She wanted to argue, to insist that she wasn't prepared for this, but the truth was undeniable. She was already here, already entangled. Adrian's eyes never left her, tracking every micro-expression, every subtle hesitation. She realized then that his control was not about brute force, it was about attention, calculation, precision, and she couldn't hide anything, not even the tiniest flicker of fear or fascination. They spent hours discussing logistics, strategy, and contingencies, though she asked questions carefully, not daring to overstep, yet feeling her confidence grow as fragments of understanding clicked into place. Each insight was a dangerous thrill, making her pulse spike with excitement and dread in equal measure. When she finally left the rooftop penthouse, the night air hit her like a shockwave. The city below seemed smaller, insignificant, because the weight of Adrian's world pressed against her mind like gravity. She walked carefully, aware that someone could be watching, listening, evaluating her just as she had been learning to evaluate others. The following days were a blur of tension and curiosity. Every phone call, every message, every glance from a stranger felt amplified. She could sense Adrian's influence even when he wasn't present. It was intoxicating and exhausting. The knowledge that she had crossed a line, the invisible boundary between ordinary life and the dangerous, magnetic orbit of a man like Adrian, settled over her like a second skin. She couldn't retreat, not truly. Her heart raced at every thought of him, every memory of his gaze, the way he had drawn her in, controlled the environment around her, and left her both terrified and wanting more. The real cost of curiosity revealed itself in subtle ways: anxiety that mingled with exhilaration, fear tangled with desire, and a growing sense that the line between danger and passion was thinner than she had ever imagined. Then came the night she understood that being close to him was more dangerous than she could have anticipated. She was at a quiet cafe, trying to process the events of the past week, when two men approached, well-dressed, professional, and unsettlingly calm. One handed her a card with a single instruction: tonight. Do not refuse. Her stomach dropped. It was clear that Adrian was aware, that this was orchestrated, that her every move was being watched and measured. When she arrived at the location, a lavish, abandoned ballroom with chandeliers casting fractured light across the dust-speckled floor, she saw Adrian waiting. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her immediately. He let her observe the room, its grandeur, the subtle signs of his control over even abandoned spaces, and when he finally approached, his presence filled the room completely. You're learning fast, he said softly, but knowledge alone doesn't protect you. Only understanding, and you're only beginning. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She realized then that staying close to him meant more than curiosity. It demanded vigilance, awareness, and a willingness to accept danger as a constant companion. And yet, something else had emerged, something she hadn't anticipated. She wanted to see where this went, to push the boundaries further, to challenge him in ways that were reckless and thrilling all at once. She wanted to step closer, even knowing the cost. Adrian studied her silently, then smiled faintly, that small, unreadable smile that carried both promise and warning. You've crossed the invisible line, he said finally. There's no going back. Maya felt a thrill unlike anything she had experienced. Fear, excitement, desire, and danger mingled in her chest, heavy and intoxicating. She knew he was right. She had crossed a line, and whatever came next, she was in it fully, whether she wanted to admit it or not. The night stretched long, filled with subtle tension and unspoken rules, and when she finally left, the knowledge settled in her mind. The cost of curiosity wasn't just danger, it was transformation. She wasn't the same woman who had dared him in the lounge, not anymore. Every step in Adrian's world demanded awareness, courage, and surrender to the intensity she had chosen. And the more she surrendered, the more she realized that the man she had dared to provoke was no longer just a challenge. He was a force she couldn't ignore, a gravity she couldn't escape, and a danger that thrilled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The following days blurred into a strange rhythm for Maya. Every morning, she woke with the memory of Adrian's presence lingering in her mind, a shadow she couldn't shake, and every night, her dreams were filled with fragments of his voice, his gaze, and the weight of the world he commanded. She tried to convince herself that it was merely fascination, a dangerous curiosity, but the truth was far more complex. She was drawn to him, not just to the power he wielded, but to the intensity, the precision, the undeniable danger that seemed to orbit him as naturally as gravity. When Adrian called her again, it wasn't a casual invitation. The text simply said, "Come. Learn." And she obeyed, because she had learned that obedience here was not submission, it was survival, and perhaps, the only way to understand a man like him without losing herself completely. She arrived at a secluded rooftop once more, the night thick with fog, the city lights dim and distant below. Adrian was already there, leaning against the railing, hands in his pockets, the wind tousling his dark hair slightly, making him look untouchable and almost mythical. "You're late," he said, his voice calm but edged with amusement. Maya shook her head, denying it, though she knew her internal clock had betrayed her, stolen by the anticipation and the nervous tension that never left her when she approached him. He gestured toward a set of tables arranged with documents, blueprints, and what appeared to be surveillance notes, and she realized this would not be a casual encounter. Every meeting with Adrian carried weight, every word was deliberate, and every silence was as meaningful as speech. He didn't waste time with small talk. "You're learning," he said, "but knowledge without understanding is dangerous. You must comprehend strategy, observation, and risk, not just for others, but for yourself." Maya nodded, trying to absorb everything he said, knowing that one misstep, one question too many, could signal weakness or ignorance. Yet there was something exhilarating in this intensity, something that made her pulse spike as she noticed the subtle nuances of his movements, the way he watched her, measured her, challenged her without a word, and the way his attention felt both comforting and terrifying at once. They spent hours discussing scenarios, planning, and evaluating possibilities, each exercise more intricate than the last. Adrian pushed her to anticipate outcomes, to predict human behavior, to understand the invisible currents that controlled not just business but alliances, fear, and loyalty. At times, he grew quiet, letting her struggle to reach the conclusions herself, and she noticed that the moments of his silence were often the most revealing. She began to understand that his world was not ruled by chaos but by calculated precision, and the closer she observed, the more she felt herself becoming a part of it, sharper, more aware, yet increasingly vulnerable to its intensity. As the night wore on, Adrian leaned back, studying her with a gaze that burned beneath the surface. "You're intrigued," he said softly. "And you shouldn't be. This isn't fascination, it's danger masquerading as opportunity. Most people fail when they step too close, because they confuse attraction with understanding. But you're different. You want the challenge." Maya's breath caught. There was no flattery in his tone, only acknowledgement, precise and unavoidable. "Maybe," she admitted quietly, "I do want the challenge. But I also want to survive it." His faint smile was the kind that unsettled her. It wasn't warmth, but recognition, and she realized she had crossed a line between fear and desire she could no longer ignore. He stepped closer, and Maya could feel the heat radiating from him even through the thin night air. "Survival," he said, "is about understanding your opponent, knowing the stakes, and never underestimating the cost of proximity. You've already learned that risk has consequences, haven't you?" She nodded, swallowing hard, because the truth of his words resonated deeper than she wanted to admit. She had witnessed his world, felt its gravity, and understood that every choice came with weight, and yet, she couldn't turn away. Her curiosity, her defiance, her desire to see where this path led, these things had become as much a part of her as breathing. Adrian studied her for a long moment, the wind stirring around them, the city below alive yet distant. "You are aware," he said finally, "that proximity to me changes everything. It's not just danger, it's visibility, scrutiny, and influence. You are becoming involved. And involvement has a price." Maya swallowed, the truth of his statement pressing against her chest. "I know," she said. "I've already felt it." His eyes narrowed slightly, assessing, measuring. "Good," he said, "because temptation here is twofold. You are tempted by danger, yes, but also by the control, the strategy, and perhaps, by me." The admission, subtle yet deliberate, sent a jolt through her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet oddly exhilarated, because the recognition of attraction was no longer a secret to him. "And if I am?" she asked, voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Then," he replied softly, "you must decide if your curiosity is stronger than your caution." Most people fail at that moment. Most choose comfort over risk, illusion over reality. But you, he let the sentence hang, unfinished, leaving her to fill in the implications. She felt the thrill of being acknowledged, measured, and challenged simultaneously. She had never encountered someone who made intensity feel like both a threat and an invitation. They continued working late into the night, analyzing movements, predicting responses, and discussing contingency plans, all the while a subtle tension hummed beneath every word, every glance. Maya realized she had reached a strange equilibrium. She respected Adrian's power, feared its consequences, yet could not resist the pull of his presence. By the time she left, the city was quiet, the streets empty, and the weight of the world he commanded pressed down upon her. Yet, within that pressure, she discovered something else, a thrill, a pulse of exhilaration that made her aware, more than ever, that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no easy retreat. Adrian's influence was no longer a shadow at the edges of her life, it was a force she couldn't ignore, and she knew, deep down, that the choices she made from this point forward would define not just her survival, but who she was becoming. As she walked home, she understood something vital. This was no longer about defiance, survival, or simple curiosity. It was about navigating a world where attraction, danger, and strategy intertwined, where every glance could shift power, and where every decision carried consequence. And more frightening, more thrilling than anything else, was the realization that she wanted to see how far she could go, even if it meant risking everything. Adrian Volkov was no longer just a man in her life, he was a force reshaping her very instincts, drawing her deeper into a world she could never leave unchanged. The days that followed became a delicate, dangerous dance. Maya found herself moving through her own life with a new awareness, noticing the subtle shifts caused by her proximity to Adrian Volkov, understanding that even mundane encounters had a ripple effect in his world. Every conversation, every glance, every decision seemed imbued with consequence, and she carried the weight of it silently, even as the pulse of excitement that came from being near him refused to fade. When Adrian summoned her next, it was to a private club he owned, an exclusive space hidden behind the facade of a nondescript building in the city's industrial district. The entrance was guarded, subtle, almost invisible unless one knew precisely where to look, and Maya's heart thudded with both anticipation and apprehension as she followed the steps leading to a world she had long suspected existed but never truly believed she would witness. Inside, the club was dimly lit, smoky, and intoxicating, alive with murmured conversations, the subtle scent of expensive cologne and perfume mixing in the air. She saw men and women moving through the space with the quiet confidence of those accustomed to power, yet every eye that flicked toward her reminded her that Adrian's world observed, measured, and catalogued everything. He appeared behind her without a sound, his presence making her stomach tighten. "Welcome," he said quietly, his voice calm yet edged with unmistakable authority. "You're here because observation is the first lesson." She nodded, unsure what exactly she was meant to observe, but instinctively sensing that the lesson was as much about behavior and reaction as it was about strategy. He guided her to a private booth with a perfect vantage of the room. "Watch," he instructed, "and understand. You will see alliances, deceptions, weaknesses, and opportunities. Every interaction is a message, every pause, a signal. Most people don't notice these things, but you must." Maya watched as Adrian's eyes moved across the room, subtle shifts of expression revealing information she could only begin to interpret. He was a predator in his element, calm, calculating, aware of every movement, every word, every unspoken tension. She felt the pull of fascination once more, realizing with both fear and thrill that she had stepped into a world where understanding could be just as intoxicating and just as dangerous as desire. As the night progressed, she began to notice patterns. The slight way a man straightened when Adrian approached, the nervous glance of a woman who knew she was being evaluated, the unspoken power struggles that threaded beneath the surface like a hidden current. Adrian leaned toward her at one point, his warm, controlled presence pressing against her awareness. "Do you see it?" he asked softly. "Every interaction carries intent. Every choice has cost. And most people, blind to consequence, fail before they even begin." Maya nodded, feeling the truth of it deep in her chest. The complexity of his world was mesmerizing, terrifying, and addictive. As the evening wore on, Adrian's focus shifted from observation to challenge. "You're tempted," he murmured, voice low, almost a caress. "By the world, yes, but also by me. Don't mistake your curiosity for safety, it is not. Temptation has a cost." Maya's pulse spiked, not just from proximity, but from the raw honesty in his voice, the weight of the power he exuded effortlessly. She realized he wasn't merely testing her understanding, he was testing her self-control, her ability to resist being consumed by attraction, by desire, by the thrill of proximity to someone so intense that it made the world outside feel almost unreal. She wanted to argue, to deny, to insist she could maintain distance, but the truth was undeniable. The pull toward him was stronger than any rational defense. The night ended abruptly. Adrian instructed her to follow him into a private room, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the skyline glittering like distant stars. There was no audience, no distraction, only the two of them. "Tonight is a test," he said. "Not of skill, but of will. You have observed, you have absorbed, but now you must decide what you are willing to risk." Maya felt the tension tighten like a coil inside her. "What do you mean?" she asked. He stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne overpowering, the heat of his presence almost physical. "You've come far," he said. "Closer than most dare. But proximity is dangerous. Not everyone survives it." She understood then that this was more than a lesson in observation or strategy. It was a test of desire, of restraint, of knowing how far she could step without losing herself entirely. "And if I fail?" she asked quietly, heart pounding. Adrian's expression remained calm, but there was a flash in his eyes that made her pulse spike. "Then," he said, "the world will remind you of your place." His words were not a threat. They were a fact. And yet, the intensity of it, the blend of danger and attraction, made her ache with a mixture of fear and exhilaration she had never known. For the first time, Maya realized that she wanted to step closer, to test her limits, to see how far she could go into his world, even knowing the price might be her sense of safety, her sense of self, or even her heart. Adrian studied her silently, a predator measuring, evaluating, deciding how far he would allow the game to go. His hand rested lightly on the table between them, a subtle boundary, a challenge, a promise. Every choice, he said finally, reveals character. Courage without wisdom is reckless, desire without caution is dangerous. You must balance all of it. Maya's chest tightened. The stakes were clear, and the pull toward him was undeniable. She had crossed lines she could not undo, entered a world she could not escape, and yet she felt alive in a way she had never felt before. Adrian Volkov was no longer just a man she had dared, he was a force reshaping the very rhythm of her life, her thoughts, her impulses. And she understood, finally, that temptation in his presence was not merely a test, it was the essence of his world, and anyone who ignored it paid the consequences. As she left the private club that night, the cool air hitting her face like a shockwave, Maya felt the weight of choice pressing against her. She was no longer a passive observer, she was involved, complicit, and undeniably affected. And somewhere deep inside, beneath fear and fascination, she acknowledged a thrilling truth: she wanted more. She wanted to see how far she could step into this world, how close she could come without breaking, and perhaps, how much of herself she was willing to risk for the chance to stand beside a man who both terrified and captivated her completely. Maya knew that crossing this line, this invisible threshold of proximity and desire, was dangerous. But the danger was addictive, and for the first time, she didn't want to turn back. Adrian Volkov had become the gravity of her world, and she was helpless, and unwilling, to resist it. Maya had reached a point she could no longer deny. Adrian Volkov's world had claimed her in ways she had never imagined, and the gravity of it was both terrifying and irresistible. Every step she took now was measured against the invisible rules he had set, the boundaries he had tested, and the intensity that radiated from him like heat from fire. She woke each morning with a mixture of anticipation and dread, knowing that any interaction could shift the balance, that any glance or word could ripple through his world in ways she could never fully predict. And yet, she felt alive in a way she hadn't known existed before, her instincts sharpened, her awareness heightened, her mind and body on constant alert. It was exhausting, intoxicating, and, most dangerously, addictive. That evening, she received a message, simple, precise, and impossibly commanding: now. Come. She understood immediately that this was more than a casual meeting, it was a culmination, a reckoning. The location was a private rooftop, high above the city, the skyline glowing under the moonlight. The wind carried a chill, but her blood thrummed with warmth, tension, and something darker that she dared not name. When she arrived, Adrian was already there, as if he had anticipated her exact moment of arrival, his figure outlined against the night, a dark silhouette radiating authority, danger, and a magnetism she could not resist. "You're here," he said, voice low, controlled, yet edged with something she could not read: approval, warning, desire. Good. She nodded, suddenly aware of how her heart raced, how her pulse had quickened the moment she stepped onto the rooftop, how the air itself seemed charged with anticipation. "I don't know what this is about," she admitted, though part of her already did, and that part thrilled and terrified her at once. Adrian didn't answer directly. Instead, he stepped closer, the wind whipping around them, his presence filling the space completely. "Do you know what it means to be in my world?" he asked, tone soft yet precise. "To step closer than most ever dare." Maya shook her head slightly, though the truth pressed against her chest. She had glimpsed the world, understood its mechanics, felt its thrill and its danger, but she had not anticipated the depth of its demands, the pull it exerted on her mind, body, and instincts. "You've already crossed the line," he continued, eyes locked on hers, piercing and unrelenting. "There is no going back. Every step you take now is permanent, every choice irreversible. You wanted intensity, you have it. You wanted challenge, you've found it. And now, you will understand what it truly costs to be close to me." The words were a statement of fact, not threat, and the clarity of it made her pulse spike. She realized fully, in that moment, that she had chosen this world of danger, strategy, and seduction, and there was no turning away. The rooftop was silent except for the wind, and Adrian's eyes studied her as if he could see past her carefully constructed defenses. "Do you understand what proximity to me requires?" he asked. "Not just courage, but awareness, precision, restraint. Most people fail because they are unprepared for the weight of my world. And you're walking on the edge." Maya met his gaze, unflinching, heart pounding, aware of the electricity between them, aware that every instinct screamed both caution and desire. "I know," she whispered. "I've felt it every day since I stepped into your world." A faint smile, subtle but dangerous, curved his lips. "Good," he said, "because temptation will follow you constantly. Danger will shadow your steps. And attraction, desire, will test your judgment more than anything else. If you survive all that, if you can navigate it, then perhaps, you might stand beside me." The intensity of his words, the weight behind them, left her breathless. She realized that standing beside him was no longer a choice of convenience, it was a challenge that demanded everything she could give. "Am I supposed to be afraid?" she asked, voice steady despite the rapid beat of her heart. Adrian studied her for a long moment, and then shook his head slowly. "Fear alone won't protect you. Respect, awareness, and precision will. Desire without caution will destroy you. Curiosity without strategy will kill you. And yet, you keep coming closer." There was a pause, charged, deliberate, as if he were measuring not just her courage but the depth of her understanding. "Why?" he finally asked. Maya's answer came without hesitation. "Because I want to know how far I can go. I want to see what this world is. I want to understand you." The words trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer intensity of admitting them aloud. Adrian's gaze sharpened, assessing, calculating, and then softened ever so slightly, a flicker of something she had never seen in him before. "Very few people dare to say that," he murmured. "And even fewer survive the consequences of wanting it." The wind gusted, pulling at her hair, at the edges of her clothes, at the fragile calm she tried to maintain. She felt the pull of everything he represented: power, danger, allure, unpredictability, and realized that whatever came next would change her irrevocably. Adrian stepped closer, the space between them shrinking, the world below fading in importance. "You have chosen this path," he said, voice almost intimate now, "and there is no undoing it. The intensity, the risk, the desire, it will claim you piece by piece if you let it. But perhaps you are ready." Maya swallowed hard, feeling her own courage flare against the edge of fear. "I am," she said, and the word felt heavier, more binding than any promise, because it was true. She had stepped into his world fully, willingly, and she could not turn back. Adrian's eyes softened fractionally, a rare glimpse of acknowledgement, and yet the danger remained, palpable, electric, unavoidable. "Then we proceed," he said simply. "Together. And nothing will ever be the same again." As she looked out over the city, the lights twinkling below, Maya realized the full truth. Her life had been irrevocably altered the moment she dared him in the lounge, the moment she chose curiosity over caution, defiance over safety. Adrian Volkov was no longer just a force she had encountered, he was the center of her world, the gravity she could neither resist nor escape. She understood that there was no ordinary path back to her previous life, that the choices she had made, the line she had crossed, would define her from now on. And in that realization, terrifying as it was, Maya felt a thrill unlike any she had ever known. She was alive, completely, utterly, irreversibly alive, and it was because she had chosen to step fully into Adrian's world, knowing every risk, feeling every pulse of desire, and accepting the consequences that came with proximity to a man as intense, as dangerous, and as irresistible as Adrian Volkov. The rooftop fell silent, wind whispering around them, city lights casting long shadows across the floor. And in that silence, in that tension, in the weight of everything they had crossed together, Maya knew one thing with absolute certainty: she had crossed the point of no return. There was no turning back, no retreat, no escape. She was here, she was in his world. And for better or worse, she would never be the same again.